Alina was not supposed to be on that mission. She was a last-minute replacement for the crew's science officer who got injured just before launch. Now she was falling through the sky, strapped inside a broken escape pod. Alarms screamed around. Her sparks flew from the control panel, and the small window showed only flames and smoke outside. Her hands gripped the seat, knuckles white, as she whispered, "Please don't let me die here." The pod crashed into the ground with a loud thud, shaking everything. Silence followed, only the sound of fire crackling and metal groaning. Alina opened her eyes slowly, her vision blurry. She had survived. But the pod was almost destroyed. She unbuckled herself and pushed open the door, coughing as smoke hit her face. The air outside was dry, hot, and filled with yellow dust. She stepped out and looked around. She was on a deserted planet, with no trees, no water, and no sign of life. Only rocks, sand, and strange red mountains in the distance. Her voice cracked as she spoke to herself. "Where am I?" The communicator was dead, and the emergency beacon was broken. She had no food, very little water, and only a basic survival kit. Her heart pounded with fear. But she took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. She checked the pod again, looking for anything useful. Then she saw something strange. Tracks, not from her pod, and not human. They were large, wide, and three-toed, like something heavy had walked nearby. Her body went cold. "I'm not alone," she whispered. She followed the tracks carefully, holding her small survival knife in one hand. She didn't walk far before she saw smoke in the distance, another crash site as she approached. She saw a much larger ship, badly damaged and half buried in the ground. Parts of it were still burning, and the area smelled like melted plastic and burnt metal. She stayed low, moving quietly. Suddenly, a shadow moved near the wreckage. She froze, hiding behind a rock, her breath shallow. It was an alien, tall, with dark skin that shimmered in the sunlight, long arms, and a strange crest on its head. It looked injured, limping as it tried to drag something from the wreck. Alina had never seen a species like it before, but it didn't look friendly. She stayed hidden, watching, unsure what to do. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew sand into her face, and she coughed. The alien turned and spotted her instantly, eyes glowing faintly. It let out a sound, not a scream, but a warning, deep and sharp. Alina raised her hand slowly. "I'm not your enemy," she said, even though it probably didn't understand. The alien didn't attack, but it didn't come closer either. It looked at her, then at the broken ship, then back at her. Finally, it turned and limped away toward the rocks. Alina stood still for a long time, unsure what had just happened. Then she realized the alien didn't want to fight. It was surviving, just like her. Later that night, as the twin moons rose in the sky, Alina returned to her escape pod and tried to sleep. The heat from the day was gone, replaced by freezing cold. She wrapped herself in a thermal blanket, shivering, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept thinking about the alien, its injuries, and the strange look it gave her. Not hatred, but something else, curiosity, maybe even fear. Suddenly she heard a noise. Her eyes snapped open and she sat up. Listening, footsteps, slow and heavy. Walking around her shelter, she held her breath and grabbed her knife, ready to defend herself. But then the impossible happened. The alien stepped into view, slowly, hands open, showing no weapon. It looked at her and then pointed at the ground, as if asking to sit. Alina didn't speak, just nodded once. They sat in silence. Two beings from different worlds, watching each other under the pale moons. They didn't speak, but they both knew they were alone on this planet, and if they wanted to survive, they would have to do it together. Far above them in the dark sky, no ships came, no help, no rescue, only stars and silence. But something was coming, something neither of them could predict. And it had already begun. Alina sat across from the alien, her eyes wide open in the dark, her breath slow but alert. The tiny campfire between them giving off just enough heat and light to keep away the cold and the fear. The alien didn't speak, and neither did she, not for a long time. They just watched each other, both unsure, both trapped on this strange planet with no way out. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't angry, it was careful. The alien's name, she would learn later, was Kareth. He pointed at himself and made the sound slowly, then pointed at her. She hesitated. Then said Alina. Kareth tried to repeat it, but it came out as Alina, close enough. A small, awkward smile appeared on her face, and to her surprise, the alien tilted his head slightly like he understood the emotion. They spent the next day searching for food and fresh water. It wasn't easy. Most of the plants were either dry, sharp, or glowing in ways that made Alina too nervous to touch them. But Kareth seemed to know what was safe. He broke open a large cactus-like plant and handed her the inner part. It tasted bitter, but it was wet and filled her stomach just enough. They couldn't speak the same language, but their movements, gestures, and expressions began to build a silent understanding. When Alina pointed to the sky and frowned, Kareth nodded slowly and traced something on the ground that looked like a ship, then crossed it out with a long scratch. There was no way off this planet, not yet. At night, the temperature dropped again, and a cold wind howled through the rocks. Alina sat beside the fire, hugging her knees, shivering hard even inside her blanket. Kareth moved a little closer, then paused, waiting for permission. She didn't speak, but she nodded slightly, and he sat beside her, his body warm and still. Alina noticed then how tired he looked. His injuries from the crash were worse than he had let on. A large cut ran along his ribs, covered in dried, cracked fluid like blood, and his breathing was shallow. She grabbed a med patch from her kit and showed it to him. First he pulled back, unsure of her intentions, but she gently pressed it against her own arm, showing it didn't hurt. Slowly, he allowed her to place it over his wound. He flinched, but didn't stop her. The next day, something changed. They were exploring a rocky area when a low growl echoed from the cliffs nearby. Alina froze, looking up. A creature twice the size of a man stood on the ledge, its eyes glowing, mouth wide, with long, curved teeth. Kareth pushed her behind him and let out a strange, deep sound, like a growl, but controlled. The creature hissed and retreated, vanishing into the shadows. That night, Alina couldn't sleep. She watched Kareth as he sat awake, staring into the fire, his muscles tense, his eyes scanning the dark constantly. She realized then that even though they had no reason to trust each other, Kareth had protected her without hesitation, again and again. The next morning, they found strange footprints around their camp, 3 claws, deep prints, and a trail of dried slime behind them. Kareth looked worried, and for the first time since they met, he touched her shoulder, gently guiding her to pack up. They had to move. They climbed a steep ridge together, carrying their limited supplies. Searching for better shelter, the climb was hard. Alina slipped twice, and Kareth caught her both times, his grip firm and warm. When they reached the top, the view stole her breath. Endless canyons, rivers of dust, and in the far distance, what looked like a ruined structure half buried in sand. They decided to head toward it, but the journey would take days. They camped in a cave that night. The wind outside screamed like a beast, and the cold became unbearable. Alina curled under her blanket, teeth chattering. Kareth hesitated, then moved behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind. Sharing his body heat without saying a word, she didn't resist. The warmth of his skin against her back slowly eased her shaking. And for the first time since the crash, She slept without fear in the middle of the night. She woke to a noise outside the cave, soft at first, then louder, wet, squelching steps. Kareth was already awake, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He motioned for silence. They stayed frozen for what felt like hours. The sound passed, and silence returned. But the message was clear. They were not alone here, and whatever was watching them. It was getting bolder. The next morning, the air felt different, heavier, like the planet itself was holding its breath. Kareth looked at Alina as they packed up, his eyes filled with a strange calm. Maybe even respect. They were no longer strangers. They were survivors, and the planet was only getting more dangerous. As they began their march toward the distant ruins, neither of them noticed the strange mark glowing faintly on Kareth's arm, a mark that pulsed gently every time he looked at Alina. Something had begun, something ancient, and soon the planet would no longer be their only problem. The wind tore across the dry plains as Alina and Kareth walked in silence, each step kicking up thin clouds of dust that stuck to their clothes and skin. The world around them was quiet, too quiet. No insects, no birds, no movement except their own shadows stretching under the twin suns. Alina kept glancing back, her instincts whispering that something was following them. But every time she turned, the horizon remained empty. Kareth didn't speak, but his posture had changed. His shoulders were tight, and his eyes constantly scanned the rocks above them. Alina noticed a soft shimmer running under his skin again. The same strange glow she had seen back in the cave when she asked him about it. He didn't answer, only touched the place between his chest and shoulder. Then looked at her with a strange mix of concern and something else she didn't recognize. By midday, they found a narrow canyon and decided to rest inside it. Its walls offered shade from the brutal heat. Alina sat down and drank from her last water pack, her lips dry and cracked. Her voice barely a whisper. How much farther? Kareth pointed toward the east, then drew a small shape in the sand. A tall structure with sharp lines. It looked like a tower or maybe a signal station. It gave her hope. If they could reach it, maybe they could call for help, or at least find shelter. But something in the canyon felt wrong. A low hum vibrated through the stone, almost like the air was alive. Alina stood slowly, her hand going to her belt. Her knife was still there, small and useless. But it gave her some sense of control. Kareth was still, his head tilted, listening to something she couldn't hear. Suddenly, his eyes widened. He turned to her sharply and spoke one word in his deep voice. Run. She didn't question it. She grabbed her pack and took off down the canyon as fast as she could, her boots slipping on loose stones. Behind her, the walls of the canyon shook, a massive rumble rising like thunder. She glanced back once and screamed. A monstrous creature, pale and covered in armored plates, was crawling out of the rock itself, its body wide and long like a centipede, but with jagged teeth and red glowing eyes. Kareth was running behind her, faster than she had ever seen him move, his injured leg barely slowing him down. The creature let out a deafening screech, and the ground cracked beneath them. Alina nearly fell as a chunk of canyon floor split open. She jumped across the gap, barely making it. But Kareth was right behind her, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward as the beast lunged from behind. They didn't stop running until they reached the open desert again. Gasping for breath, Alina dropped to her knees, coughing and shaking. Kareth stood over her, scanning the horizon. The creature hadn't followed. It remained inside the canyon, its shrieks echoing off the walls, fading into the distance. For now, they were safe, but something had changed. The planet was no longer just dangerous. It was alive in a way they hadn't expected. It reacted to their presence as if watching and learning, waiting for weakness. Alina looked up at Kareth, noticing the shimmering under his skin was brighter now, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, and a wave of emotion rushed through her, not hers, but his: fear, confusion, protectiveness, and something else buried deep. Something ancient. Alina pulled her hand back quickly, staring at him. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. Kareth didn't answer. But he didn't have to. Something had connected between them, more than words, more than touch, that night. As they camped on a small ridge, the temperature dropped again, and Alina built a small fire using dried roots they had collected. Kareth sat nearby, still quiet. She watched him, wondering who he really was, where he came from, and why his body reacted to hers the way it did. Her mind replayed the moment in the cave, the warmth, the safety, and now this bond. She touched her side where the alien fruit had cut her days ago. It was fully healed now, too quickly, faster than any human wound should have healed. Kareth had treated her, but his blood had touched her skin, maybe even entered the cut. She shivered as the thought grew louder in her mind. Her body didn't feel the same anymore. Her muscles ached differently. Her dreams were strange and filled with lights and sounds she had never known before. That night, she had another dream, but it didn't feel like a dream. She stood in a room filled with blue light, surrounded by tall, glowing figures, whispering. In a language she somehow understood, they spoke of bonding, of connection, of new life. One figure turned to her and placed a hand on her stomach, and Alina woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, her hands shaking. Kareth was already awake, sitting beside her, as if he had been waiting. She met his eyes. And for the first time, she spoke without fear. "Something's happening to me." He didn't move, didn't speak. But his gaze dropped to her midsection. Then back to her face. He already knew. Alina placed both hands on her belly. And though there was no bump, no sign, she felt it. Something inside her had changed. Something was growing, not painful, not unnatural, but powerful. A new warmth now lived inside her, and she wasn't sure if it was terrifying or beautiful. The fire between them crackled softly, and above them the stars burned cold and silent. Far from Earth, far from rescue, and far from understanding. But one thing was certain: she was no longer alone in her own body. And this planet was not finished with her yet. The night didn't feel real anymore, not after what Alina had just felt inside her body. The desert winds whispered through the rocks like ghost voices, and the stars overhead blinked slowly, as if watching. Her fingers still rested lightly on her stomach. But it wasn't fear that filled her. It was something stranger, something deeper. Kareth sat across from her, still as stone. But his eyes were heavy with something unspoken. She didn't sleep, neither did he, and when the pale light of dawn broke over the horizon, the world felt different. They continued walking, heading toward the distant ruins Kareth had shown her earlier, but the silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was full. Like both of them were thinking the same impossible thought, but were too afraid to say it. By midday, the heat returned, stronger than ever. The ground shimmered and cracked beneath their feet. Kareth led the way, pausing often, making sure. Alina kept up, but she was slower now, her legs heavy, her skin too hot. Her breathing shallow. Kareth stopped and looked back. A deep frown across his alien features. Alina took one more step, then stumbled to her knees. Clutching her head, something pulsed inside her. Not pain, but pressure, rising fast like boiling water. Kareth rushed to her side, catching her. Before she fell completely, he placed a hand on her chest, then one on her forehead, and closed his eyes. A soft glow passed from his skin to hers, and her breathing slowly returned to normal. Her heart slowed, the heat faded, and the strange pressure vanished. Alina blinked, dazed, and looked up at him. "What was that?" she whispered. Kareth didn't answer in words. But his expression said enough. He had done something. Not just physical, but internal. Something connected to whatever had begun inside her. His energy was affecting her body. They found shelter in a hollow rock formation just before sunset, a jagged dome shaped like a claw reaching from the ground. Inside, it was cool and dry, and the walls were covered in strange patterns, not natural. Not alien-made either. Something ancient had once lived here, or maybe still did. Kareth stayed near the entrance, keeping watch while Alina lay on the soft sand inside. Eyes open, mind racing. She remembered everything. The crash, the fear, the survival. The first time Kareth had shared warmth with her, and now this strange bond growing deeper by the hour. Her hands trembled as she lifted her shirt slightly. Her stomach still looked the same, flat and pale. But when she pressed her palm to it, she swore she felt a flicker, not movement, but awareness, like something small had just acknowledged. Her touch. That night, a storm hit without warning. Fierce winds and needle-sharp sand howled outside their shelter. Kareth built a barrier using jagged slabs of stone, sealing the entrance partially, but the storm was loud. And the temperature dropped fast. Alina crawled closer to him, not asking, just needing warmth. Kareth didn't hesitate. He wrapped his long arms around her. Pulling her gently into his chest, the silence between them broke with a single word. Alina whispered it like a secret. "Why me?" Kareth was still. Then finally spoke in his low, careful voice. "Bond. Rare life chooses." His words were broken, but the meaning was clear enough. This wasn't something planned. It was something ancient, instinctual, and unstoppable once started. Alina rested her head against him, her voice soft. "I'm scared." Kareth said nothing, but his arms tightened slightly, holding her as if to say, "I know." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the warmth between them grew stronger. And for a moment, Alina forgot the danger, forgot the loneliness, forgot Earth in the middle of the night. She woke up gasping, her heart racing, her body hot and trembling, her eyes wide with confusion and desire. Kareth sat upright beside her, his skin glowing faintly in the dark. She reached for him before she could even think why. Her hands pulling him close, her breath shaky. Their foreheads touched, and in that instant, everything changed. It wasn't like human contact. It was more, their thoughts bled into each other, emotions shared like echoes in a cave. She saw flashes of his past battlefields, a lost homeworld, loneliness stretching across galaxies, and he saw hers. Laughter with her sister, childhood fears, the pain of being sent into space alone, and the emptiness she carried with her. The bond deepened, pulling them together not just physically, but completely. When it ended, the silence returned. But it was full of meaning now. Alina curled into his chest and whispered, "What are we?" Kareth closed his eyes and answered. One morning came without warning, and the world outside was calm again. The desert looked untouched, the sky too bright, but something inside Alina had changed again. She could feel it now, stronger, warmer, alive, and aware. She touched her stomach and felt a deep pulse. Not hers, not Kareth's. Something new. She looked at him with wide eyes, not in fear anymore, but wonder. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly. Kareth nodded slowly, his expression serious but calm. Alina stood up and walked to the entrance, staring out at the endless horizon. "So now what?" she asked, her voice carried away by the wind. Kareth stepped beside her, looked to the ruins in the distance, then said in a quiet voice, "We protect." But neither of them saw the pair of red eyes watching from a nearby rock formation, blinking slowly, silently tracking their every move. They were not alone. And something had just begun to awaken beneath the sand. The sky was too quiet, too still, like the world was holding its breath. Alina stood on a ledge, her hand resting on her lower belly as the soft wind pressed against her face. She didn't feel alone anymore, not just because Kareth stood beside her, but because something within her pulsed softly, a second heartbeat, not her own. It wasn't fear this time, it was weight, responsibility. Something new blooming inside her. But peace didn't last on this planet. And it never stayed long as they moved toward the old ruins Kareth had seen from the ridge days ago. The landscape began to change. The dry flatlands cracked and crumbled into uneven cliffs and black stones like broken glass. The wind carried strange smells, ash, metal, something rotten. Alina moved carefully, her boots scraping over the sharp rock edges while Kareth led the way silently, his tall frame moving like a shadow among the stone. Neither of them spoke much anymore. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said through their bond. They felt what the other felt, even when words failed. It was just after sunset when they first saw the ruins up close. Not buildings, but structures carved into the mountain itself. Stone arches, broken towers, and deep stairways leading underground. It looked ancient, abandoned for centuries, but not untouched. Kareth stopped at the entrance, crouched low, his hand touching the dirt. Then he stood slowly and spoke a single word. Alina followed his eyes, and sure enough, near the edge of the stone were strange indentations, not the three-toed prints of the desert predators they'd seen before, but thin, sharp slits like blades had walked there. She whispered, "What lives here?" Kareth looked at her, his face unreadable, and simply said, "Not life." Still, they entered. Because outside offered no safety either. Inside, the air was cool and heavy. The walls were covered in carvings that shimmered faintly when touched. Alina ran her fingers across them and saw flashes in her mind. Old memories, not hers, of machines, battles, and a queen with eyes like fire. She pulled back, heart racing. Kareth caught her wrist, steadying her, but his own skin was glowing brighter now. Like something in the ruins was responding to him. They found a small chamber to rest in. Sealed by a metal door, Kareth managed to close, using old alien tech still wired into the stone. Inside, they were safe, for now. Alina sat on a soft patch of moss-like plant, her back against the cold wall. She could feel the child growing. Faster than it should, her skin was more sensitive. Her hearing sharper, her dreams stranger, but none of it scared her anymore. Until she woke to the sound of Kareth growling, not loud, but deep, the kind of sound that meant danger was close. He stood at the door, his weapon drawn. Something had entered the ruins, and it was coming closer. Alina stood slowly, her body still stiff from sleep. "What is it?" she asked. Kareth answered with 2 words, "Hive." Guardians, a loud clang echoed through the tunnels, followed by scraping metal. Not footsteps, blades, claws, machines built to protect something. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She remembered the visions from the wall carvings. Machines with no eyes, no thoughts, only commands. "Why are they here?" she whispered. Kareth didn't answer, but his hand moved to her stomach gently. They weren't coming for them. They were coming for what she carried. She didn't wait, didn't argue. She grabbed her pack and followed Kareth as he led her through a narrow side tunnel. They moved quickly, the air getting colder, the sounds behind them louder. The machines were waking, and they were fast. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, broken statues, shattered crystals, and a glowing pool in the center. Kareth stopped suddenly, his eyes wide. Alina turned and saw a massive throne carved into the far wall. And above it, a single sigil, the same mark now glowing faintly on Kareth's chest. She looked at him in shock. "What does this mean?" He stepped forward and touched the mark, and the entire chamber lit up. Energy burst through the floor. The walls hummed, and the machines outside went silent. The bond between Karth and the unborn child had triggered something ancient, a memory. A code, maybe a rite of blood. Alina could feel it too, something flowing through her, protecting her, claiming her as part of something far older. Then humanity. But then the silence broke again. Louder, this time not machines, but voices, real ones. From the shadows came figures, not human, not Kareth-esque kind, but something in between. Clad in robes, armed with strange weapons, eyes glowing gold. They stopped a few meters away and stared at her. One of them stepped forward, pointed to her stomach, and said in a voice that echoed in her mind, "It has begun." Kareth moved in front of her, his body tense, but the robed figure didn't attack. Instead, it bowed. "Alina of Earth, you carry the next heir." Her heart nearly stopped, she whispered. "Heir. To what?" The figure looked up slowly. "To the Lost Empire." Alina didn't breathe for a moment, not because she couldn't, but because her entire body froze. The words echoed in her mind long after the robed figure had spoken them. "You carry the next heir." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Her hands instinctively moved to her belly, still barely round, still impossible, yet suddenly. Sacred Kareth didn't move, his stance rigid as stone. His body glowed softly, not from fear, but from something ancient power, memory, duty maybe. The robed figures didn't advance, didn't threaten. But their presence pressed like invisible weight. They had been waiting, not for her. Not for Kareth, but for the child growing inside her. Alina opened her mouth to speak, but her voice cracked, dry and uncertain. "What does that even mean?" she asked. Almost to herself, what heir, the tallest of the figures, stepped forward, his face partly hidden under a veil of light-reactive cloth. He raised a hand and pointed to the glowing symbol on the wall, the one that had activated when Kareth touched it. "That mark belongs to the first kin," he said. "The ones who were born of the stars and ruled this galaxy before time broke." His hand dropped to his side slowly. "You two have reignited the line that was thought extinct." Alina blinked hard, the air around her buzzing now. "This is a mistake," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not part of your history. I'm just a scientist from Earth, and this wasn't planned." She looked at Kareth, almost pleading. "Tell them," she whispered. "Tell them this wasn't meant to happen." But Kareth was silent. His eyes locked with the robed figures. A deep humming began under their feet. Like the heartbeat of the planet itself had awakened. Suddenly, the chamber's walls shifted, and pillars rose from the ground around them, each one displaying moving images not just of Kareth's kind, but of humans too. Alina's breath caught again as she saw a human face on one of the glowing stones. It was old, ancient even, dressed in robes similar to the ones before her now. Her mind reeled. "Humans were here before," she gasped. Kareth finally spoke, voice low. "Not just here," he said. "We were made from them." The revelation cracked through her like lightning. Alina had studied alien evolution her whole life, but this was a forgotten truth. Humanity wasn't the newest species in the stars. They were descendants of something older, perhaps scattered, perhaps erased, but now reborn through her. Suddenly, the calm shattered, the chamber shook. A loud screech echoed through the ruins. The robed figures turned sharply, their gold eyes narrowing. "They found you," the leader said sharply. Alina's skin went cold. "Who?" she asked. But the answer came in the form of a deep rumbling, followed by a distant explosion. Outside the ruins, something massive was moving. The machines from earlier, the Hive Guardians, had returned. But this time, they weren't alone. Warships, not human, not Kareth's kind, were descending, dropping creatures like armor-clad insects onto the sand. Kareth turned to Alina, his voice urgent. "They will take the child," he said. They will kill everything to stop it. The robed figures sprang into action. Walls opening to reveal hidden passageways. Weapons long buried were now active again. One handed a small device to Alina sleek. Silver and warm to the touch. A beacon, he said. If you activate this at the tower's peak, your people will come. Alina's legs shook as she held it. She didn't feel like a hero or a queen, or some chosen mother of a forgotten empire. She was tired, confused, and afraid. But when she looked down at her stomach and felt that gentle pulse again, her fear sharpened into something else. Purpose. "I'll do it," she said, voice firmer now. Kareth stepped beside her, nodding. The tallest robed figure spoke one last time. "Go north through the Flame Valley," he said. "You must reach the spire before the second moon rises." He looked at Kareth and then at her. "Guard her with your soul, Father of the Air." The ground trembled again, and dust rained down from the ceiling. They had to move. Now, Alina and Kareth ran, slipping through a narrow path as the chamber sealed behind them. Explosions rocked the ruins above, and distant war cries echoed through the tunnels. But through it all, the strange warmth in her belly grew stronger. Not pain, not fear, power. Something ancient had awakened in her blood. And now, the galaxy was racing to either claim it or destroy it. Asterisk ash floated down like snow, soft but suffocating, covering the ruins behind them. Alina clutched the small beacon tightly in her hand, her fingers raw from gripping it too hard, too long. Kareth moved just ahead of her, scanning every ridge, every rock, every shadow with deadly precision. He didn't speak, but Alina could feel his fear pulsing through their bond, not for himself, not even for her, but for the life growing inside her. Flame Valley lived up to its name. They passed through jagged cliffs that hissed with heat, the rocks glowing orange from underground magma. Steam burst from vents in the earth, and sulfur stung her eyes. But still, they pressed on. Because far in the distance, on the tallest peak, the spire shimmered like a blade pointed at the stars. That was where the beacon had to be activated. That was where help would find them, if help still existed. They stopped only once, under a black stone arch that trembled every time thunder rolled across the sky. Alina collapsed onto the ground. Breath shallow, skin slick with sweat. Her body ached in ways it never had before. The pregnancy wasn't normal. It was moving fast, too fast. Kareth knelt beside her, his fingers pressed gently to her wrist, checking the pulse he could already feel. Her eyes met his, and without a word, she knew they were running out of time. If they didn't reach the spire by nightfall, she wouldn't be able to climb it, and if they stopped for too long, they'd be caught. The sky cracked open, enemy ships tore through the clouds, black and silent, their engines whispering death. Troops dropped from above like wasps, their armor gleaming, their movements inhumanly precise. Alina could see them in the distance, too many, too fast, but they didn't fire yet. They were circling. Hurting Kareth's voice broke the silence. Deep and final. No more running. He rose to his full height and turned toward the incoming swarm. His body shimmered like starlight, and the markings across his skin glowed hot white. He turned to Alina and pressed the beacon into her hands. "Climb," he said. "Call them." "No," she said instantly, shaking her head, tears filling her eyes. "You can't fight them alone." He cupped her cheek with one hand, the other resting gently on her belly. "You are not alone," he said softly. "You carry everything now." And before she could stop him, he turned and walked toward the oncoming storm. Alina watched him disappear into the smoke, her breath catching in her throat. But she couldn't stay still. The spire called to her now, not just because of the beacon, but because the child inside her pulsed with power every time she looked at it. Something was drawing her forward, guiding her up. The climb was brutal. The ground cracked beneath her feet. Wind screamed in her ears. She scraped her knees, her hands bled. But she didn't stop. Kareth was down there buying her time. She wouldn't waste a second. Halfway up, the beacon vibrated in her grip. She paused, the ground shaking violently beneath her. In the distance, Kareth was surrounded. Dozens of enemy soldiers encircling him, weapons drawn, but he didn't fall. Not yet. And then she reached the top. The platform was small, just wide enough to stand. Ancient tech pulsed beneath her feet. Reacting to her presence, the beacon in her hand lit up, and she placed it into the center slot. A beam of light shot skyward blue, bright, pure, cutting through the ash-filled sky. A signal, a call, a scream across the stars. But would anyone answer? Behind her, the roar of engines grew louder. A dropship approached, sleek and black, its side hatches opening. Alina turned. Eyes burning with sweat and light. She had no weapons, only the bond, the child, and the last of her strength. But just as the soldiers stepped onto the spire's edge, something happened. The air around her shimmered, and a massive wave of energy pulsed out from her body. The enemies froze mid-step, their armor flickering. Weapons short-circuiting. Kareth, from the battlefield below, looked up and smiled. The child had awakened, not fully born, not fully formed, but aware and protective. Alina collapsed to her knees as the energy faded, but in the distance, a new sound, ships, not black and silent, but silver and loud, roaring through the sky. Earth's ships, human signals, her signal had reached them. They had come. Alina blinked up at the sky as lights broke through the clouds. The child inside her kicked, strong and clear. And for the first time, she smiled without fear. They had survived. They had awakened something lost to time, and now, the galaxy would never be the same.